We've now written a handful of tests around creating users and reading users out of our database. I want to skip updating users who are already saved and go on to delete first. So we're going to figure out how we're going to delete users out of our database, and then we'll circle back around to updating users. And there's a very particular reason I want to show you a little bit more about delete first. Let's first set up our test file for deleting a user, and then we'll talk about exactly why we're going over to delete. So inside of my test folder, I'm going to make a new file called delete-test.js. So inside of here, we're going to create a user and then figure out a bunch of different ways to get them out of our database. So let's first start off by putting down a little bit of test boilerplate. So we'll say const assert, we'll require assert, we'll get our user model or the user class from source user, and then we'll describe deleting a user. All right, so inside of here, or I should say the reason that we're skipping update and we're going directly over to delete is that this is going to be our first taste of some of the real truth behind the use of Mongo and Mongoose. And when I say truth, I'm referring to the fact that there are many ways to achieve the exact same effect in Mongo and Mongoose. And so deleting a user is going to be a fantastic example of that. So there are many different ways to delete records in Mongo, each of which have some, certainly some relevant application. Some of them are going to feel like, why are there so many ways to do this? But we're going to walk through each one and maybe we can get a better sense of when we might use each case. So let's check out a diagram. It's going to help us understand all the different ways to delete a record in our Mongo database. The first thing to understand is that internally, Mongoose does not use the terminology delete. It uses the terminology remove. So for purposes of our exercises, we're going to term this like deleting because we're thinking about create, update, create, read, update, destroy. But for all of Mongoose's terminology, we're using remove. So inside this diagram, we've got a reference to the model class and our model instance. So when I say model class, I'm talking about like that user variable, like the capital U user. A model instance is an instance of the user class. So this would be like Joe. So Joe has a method attached to it called remove. When we call remove, that will delete Joe from our database. Our model class also has a function called remove. This remove over here, we will pass it some criteria. Mongoose will look at all the different users in our database, find any users that match this given criteria, and then delete them. Similarly, there's also find one remove and find by ID and remove. So in total right here, you can see there's really ultimately 4 different ways in which we might remove a record from our database. Remove attached to a model instance is most useful whenever we have like a direct reference to a record, particular record inside of our program. So if we've like already fetched Joe and we have like an instance of Joe, great time to use remove. If we want to delete all of the different records in our collection with some very generic criteria, like maybe find all of my users who have a name of Joe, maybe I've got 10 different ones, that's when I might start to use remove. Find one remove is a lot like remove over here, and find by ID and remove is also kind of related to model instance remove as well. Anyways, you can see that there's just 4 different ways and they're all to some degree pretty darn similar. So let's write some tests around each of these and see if we can't figure out how each one really works. So I'm going to flip back over to our test file. And we'll start off by adding a before each hook. And inside this before each, we will create a new user of Joe and save him to our database. So that inside of each it block that we create, we will remove Joe in some various fashion and then write some tests to figure out, or just to make sure that he was actually deleted. So first we'll declare a variable called Joe, and we'll write in our before each. I expect it to be an asynchronous before each, so I'm going to add in my done callback. Then we'll make a new user of Joe, so he's going to have a name of Joe. And then we'll say joe.save. And after Joe has been saved successfully, we'll call done, like so. Cool. So now we can add in a couple of the different it blocks that we want to have in here. First, we want to test our model instance remove. I'm going to be just very explicit with each of the it statements in here, just to make sure that it's very clear what each of these methods are coming from. Our class method remove. We'll do our third one of find and remove. Class method find and remove. And then finally, class method find by ID and remove. All right, so 4 different ways. Let's immediately get started inside this section with the model instance remove. So remember, whenever I say model in here, model instance specifically versus a class, I'm talking about using this Joe object to remove Joe from the collection, as opposed to using the user class, like capital U user class, to remove a record. So these 3 tests down here, we'll use the capital U user, and this model instance right here, we'll use the actual Joe instance itself to remove him. Okay, so model instance, definitely the easiest by far. So this would be the use case where we have like already fetched this user, like we've fetched him outside of our database, maybe we took some action with him, and then we eventually came to the conclusion that, you know what, Joe's done, we're tossing him. We don't need Joe anymore. So to take an instance of a model and remove it from our database, we just call Joe, dot remove. Now, just like every other way in which we touch our MongoDB database, this is an operation that takes some amount of time, and so it's going to return a promise that will be resolved when the operation is complete. So we, of course, are going to need our done callback, so I'll add that in. And so now we need to really think about, well, how are we going to test whether or not Joe was removed? I think that after Joe is removed from our database, we need to then search through our collection and see if we can find any existing user with the name of Joe. Then if we can find a user with the name of Joe, that means that remove must have not worked. Otherwise, if there is no user with Joe, then hey, test must be passing. But that definitely leads us into a little bit of a tricky case here with dealing with promises. Because we basically want to say, let this promise run, or let this kind of like request run, let it modify the database, wait for that to be successful. Then once that's successful, go and execute this other query to find a user. And then once that is done, come back and actually make our assertion. So to make that happen, we can use a little bit of magic with promises. So we know that if we add on a .then, this .then will only be executed once the remove operation is complete. If we create a new database operation in here and return it from this .then, we can then chain on a subsequent .then, which will only be called once this second kind of little query inside of here finishes. So what I'm kind of getting at is if we add in user.find1, and we look for a user with the name of Joe, and return it from this first .then, this second one will not be called until find1 right here is complete. And then the argument to this .then right here will be whatever gets returned from this operation. So in other words, long story short, I would expect this second .then to be called with a user that was found by user.find1. So this is a little bit nasty right here. Let's first write the assertion. So I'm going to say I'm going to assert that user is null. In other words, we did not find a user. That's what I want to make sure have happen. And we'll say, add in our callback here. So let's kind of see if this works. And then I want to take a quick pause and come back and make sure that it's really clear how this kind of chained on promise is working here. So let's check out our test suite, 7 passing. Yep, I'm going to assume that's good. Let's update our, I'm going to say I expect this thing to be an empty object just to make sure this thing is actually failing or working correctly. Yep. So I'm going to say that it looks like it's working correctly. I'm going to change it back, make sure it works. Okay, so let's take a quick pause and then come back and make sure that we are really clear on how this promise setup is working right here.